Thank you, Kate. It's a great honor for me to be here. And let me first thank the Norwegian Atlantic Committee for inviting me to speak at this important conference. The title of this panel is The Resumption of Great-Power Rivalry. My argument is that there is no great power rivalry. We do not live in a multipolar international system with 3 or more great powers. Instead, we are experiencing the return of bipolarity, the resumption of a new superpower rivalry between the United States and China. The previous speaker pointed to this, and I will elaborate. This new superpower rivalry is concentrated in the Indo-Pacific and not in Europe, and it's about China's quest for regional hegemony and the United States seeking to prevent China from becoming the dominant power in the region. Why has there been a return to bipolarity and not multipolarity? First is the power gap between the United States and China. In the early 1990s, the US economy was 15 times larger than China's. Today, China's economy is about 75% of the US economy, measured in nominal terms. In purchasing power parity, China is already the largest economy in the world. In the early 1990s, the US defense spending was 20 times larger than China's. Now it is 2 to 3 times larger. The US is still more powerful than China, but China is catching up, and the US is no longer unrivaled. Second is the power gap between China and the rest. Many don't know how much China's GDP is compared to Russia, and it's actually 10 times larger. I'll repeat that. China's GDP is 10 times larger than Russia's. Many of you have heard about the BRICS. Well, if we take China out from the BRICS and we focus on Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa, these 4 countries account for about half of China's GDP. Thus, talking about great powers is a misguided view of power distribution in today's world. China's defense spending was roughly similar to Russia and India, and only half of Japan and Germany in the mid-1990s. Last year, China's defense spending was close to 5 times larger than India and Russia, and close to 6 times larger than Germany and Japan. Today, we have 2 states, the United States and China, that are much more powerful compared to any other states, and this defines the international system as bipolar. If we had a multipolar system with great powers, then the US could allow other great powers to balance each other, just as the US did prior to the First World War and the Second World War, when there was a multipolar international system. This could be the case in Europe. No states are able to dominate Europe. Russia has a GDP in between sort of Spain and Italy, and if Germany actually spends 2% on defense, Germany alone will have a larger defense spending than Russia. No European power are able to dominate the European theater. However, this is not the case in East Asia, where China's GDP and defense spending is as large as all the countries in the region combined, including India and Russia. Thus, only the US can balance China, which is similar to how the US was the only power that could balance the Soviet Union in Europe during the previous bipolar system. How can such a starting point, emphasizing the return of bipolarity and the distinction between superpowers and great powers, answer some of the questions given to the participants in this panel? Let me focus on 4 statements and questions in the program in the few remaining minutes I have left. First, it is stated that, quote, "The return of great power rivalry is by many considered the greatest threat to Allied national security," end quote. This assumption is wrong. There is no great power rivalry. The United States prioritizes the new superpower rivalry with China, but its allies in Europe will be focusing on security challenges in Europe. Some European allies will focus on Russia as their greatest threat. Others might seek some form of engagement with Russia, while other NATO allies might be more threatened by terrorism, climate change, and refugee, food, and energy crisis. Second, the panelists asked, quote, what are the consequences of war in Europe on great power dynamics, end quote. Again, bearing in mind that there is a distinction between superpower and great power rivalry, I see the following developments. Russia is, as many have already now pointed to, becoming weaker militarily and economically. To compensate for its conventional weakness, Russia needs to rely even more on nuclear weapons. The EU and NATO is relatively stronger, showing cohesion, adding new members, and emphasizing a stronger commitment to arms buildup and taking more responsibility for European defense and collective security. This allows the US to concentrate on China. And the statement from the Pentagon referring to the new national security strategy is very clear. The department will, quote, prioritizing the PRC challenge in the Indo-Pacific, then the Russia challenge in Europe, end quote. Another development, which other speakers have pointed to, is that Russia is likely to become more dependent on China. And finally, European ties with China are likely to weaken. In a new bipolar system, there will be more polarization, but we are not entering another Cold War. There are different ideological, economic, military, technological, and geopolitical developments shaping the new superpower rivalry in the 21st century. Third, quote, how will great power rivalry impact transatlantic and European security in the years to come? End quote. I think we'll see more of a division of labor, US focusing on balancing China in the Indo-Pacific, while European states take more responsibility for their own defense and security in their region. Of course, the US will not completely pull out of Europe, especially since the US Army has a limited role in a maritime theater in East Asia. So it will still have Europe as an important theater for the US Army. But the priority between the US two flanking regions is clear. Asia first, then Europe. The question is whether the division of labor will work, since it's based on different threat perceptions of China. Moreover, it remains to be seen whether European cohesion will be sustained and whether European states will be capable of taking more responsibility. Fourth and finally, quote, to what lengths are the great powers willing to go to reach their ambitions, end quote. In the current war in Ukraine, Russia is on the defensive and Ukraine is continuously resupplied. Some European leaders might look for a diplomatic solution, but understandably, Ukraine, who has fought so well, don't want to give up its territory. The Biden administration have made it clear that it wants to weaken Russia. So how this war will end is not easy to predict. The worst case scenario is that Putin might find himself in a situation where he might use tactical nuclear weapons to end the war on terms conducive to Russia. Such a scenario will be a game changer for European security and a large tragedy for the entire continent. In East Asia, we have the Taiwan issue that might spark a war between China and the United States, also with huge global implications. Due to Russia's poor military performance in Ukraine, China might need to reconsider and redevelop some of its plans for a war against Taiwan, since much of China's defense reforms and program have relied on Russian experience. But China is determined to gain control over Taiwan, and war in East Asia involving China and the United States would have strong implications for European security and NATO. In conclusion, many speakers will focus on European security landscape and Ukraine's courageous defense against the Russian invasion. This is, of course, the primary concern for European security. But we need more understanding of how the new US-China superpower rivalry affects European security, both through the US prioritizing the Indo-Pacific and in view of China's closer relations with Russia. Thank you.